Welcome to part 3 of our ScaleTrains -9 build series. In this segment, we'll cover the weathering of the locomotive, and we'll take the stock locomotive seen here and weather it to mimic prototype 4555 as seen on the BNSF circa 2017 to 2018. I've done this video a little bit different. I decided to use GoPro to see if I could capture everything, so hopefully this comes up clear enough for you and you're able to follow along. Step 1 is correcting the color and laying down the base layer of weathering. This is a technique that I learned from Gary Christensen a number of years ago. What he does and what he taught me is to use craft acrylics in order to transition the color of the base model into something that's more accurate. As it stands, the ScaleTrains orange is okay for a brand new unit, but we're modeling one that's been used for quite some time, and therefore the orange has changed a little bit. So I use some craft acrylics, just something real cheap. Take a couple of colors that are close to what I need, mix them up so that it resembles the final color that I'm going for, and I thin it with a good amount of water. You can see that on the plate there, and I start applying it to the model in very light layers. You'll have to do several layers in order to build it up, and you can see I'm kind of going around and getting every area of the model, all the orange, getting the initial base layers done. Don't worry if it gets onto other areas at all. It's very easy to remove at this stage. I should mention here that prior to doing anything, the very first thing that I do is dull coat the model, or you can use any sort of flat varnish that you like. I've had good luck with dull coat, and I typically do it through an airbrush. And I will only dull coat once at the beginning and once at the very end. I don't do it in between any of the other layers of weathering. And with the base layer of orange transition done, I went ahead and moved over to the yellow. This particular prototype, the yellow stripes and lettering had faded inconsistently, so some of them were still quite yellow, some of them were faded almost to a white. And so I went through and carefully transitioned those colors based on prototype pictures. Again, doing this in layers, so very thin layers until you build up the correct color. Added a little bit more white to the paint in certain areas as directed by pictures. Once I finished the initial coloring, I went back and cleaned off all the black lines using a toothpick that was slightly damp in water, and just gently scraping the paint off of those lines. This is a little tedious, especially with all the stripes, but it's necessary, and it's an easy way to correct areas where the paint went a little bit too far. And again, I'm doing the same thing on the other side of the model. One thing I found with weathering is that I will tend to do an entire layer or an entire step on all sides of the model before I move to the next step. So I faded all the orange first, and then I did all the yellow next, and then I moved on to the next step after that. After I finished the orange and the yellow, I then mixed up some oils, black and raw umber, thinned them out greatly with water. These are water mixable oils, and then very carefully, using a very thin brush, I applied what's called a pin wash to all the door seams on all sides of the model, including all the panels. And what you want is this this wash to flow into these lines without getting all over the place. Anything that got outside the lines, I used a damp brush and quickly got it out of the way. This replicates the grime that gets into these areas and allows us to see them a little bit better on a small model. I then began to color transition the green to the correct color. Again, the prototype had been in service for some time, so the green had faded. So I used some cheap craft acrylics, mixed up the correct color, thinned it with water, and applied it lightly in layers to all the appropriate areas. With the basic color transitioning out of the way, I transitioned to the body grime. This is one of the few areas that I use oils. I typically will use water mixable oils, and here I'm using a combination of raw umber and black, thinning it out quite a bit, and you can see that I'm building it up in very thin layers. Here I'm moving on to the walkways. The way I do this is I first get the walkways wet with just plain water, then I'm going through with very diluted colors, some raw umber, some gray, a little bit of white, I'm applying those colors, and that will allow, the water allows those colors then to bleed out so you don't get any hard edges. And you can go back in and vary the colors. I'm adding a little bit of darker here now, based on prototype pictures, a little bit of black for some oil leakage, and you can see that these colors will all blend together because the water is still wet. Going through now and doing a little bit of detailing on the body. Here I was adding some of the reflective strips along the sill and just kind of lining them up. These are decals in this particular case. Sometimes I will use the reflective ones. Adding the numbers now to the locomotive. I did not gloss the entire model. I just painted a little layer of some future floor polish. You can see, if you look carefully in the video, there's a little patch right where I placed the decals, and that way I don't have to coat the entire model. And I set my decals using Walther's Solvaset. Alright, moving on to the underframe now. The underframe is done much the same as color transitioning the rest of the model. My first go-to color whenever I'm doing any underframe work is raw umber. That allows me to get kind of a base layer. You can see that I'm working it in underneath the sill, getting all around all the piping, along the frame rails, and doing a very light layer along all the trucks and side frames. So this is the initial layer. It's not designed to be perfect or anything yet, but I am getting the first layer on. Once this layer dries, I will go back and I'll do a second layer, which you can see here now. And during the second layer and subsequent layers, I'll vary the color a little bit based on the prototype pictures. Around the brake gear, I typically will make it a little bit darker, particularly in this model since it's a little out to the side. I need it to blend in and look a little deeper. I make sure that I coat all the areas around the side frames that typically will get grime on them, so that way you're not seeing any clean silver. And now I'm going back in with a little bit more burnt umber this time, so a little bit more of a kind of a rich brown color based on the prototype pictures, and I'm working it in where the photos show. Now at this point, I'm beginning to highlight some of the areas around the side frames, the journals, the springs, and things. And this I will use water mixable oils for, and just straight black. I'll mix it very thin and allow it to flow into those areas in order to get into the grooves. It gives it a lot more depth. Now along the body, right above the side frames, there's typically some grime that gathers here, and again I'm doing a very thin layer of water mixable oils, a little bit of raw umber, a little bit of burnt umber there as well. After it dries, I'll go back in, do another layer, again based on prototype photos, on all four corners. In this case here, I'm adding a little bit of dust, and this is actually dry brushing. I'm mixing a little bit of raw sienna and white, and it creates a nice dust color. This was a tip from Gary Christensen that works very well. And you can see as we continue that things are starting to take shape. The grime is looking better as we build up in small layers. Once I finished the majority of the underframe, I then turned my attention to the fuel tank. The fuel tank can be tough just because it's so easily seen, and we don't want to have anything that looks out of place there. And so light layers again is the key. I'm using raw umber just like I did for the rest of the underframe. I do a very light layer along the side of the tank, and then I went through and started to get everything inside. Going now to the second layer after the first layer has dried, and I'm varying the strength a little bit based on the prototype pictures. Turn my attention back now to the air tanks, and the prototype had some rust spotting, flaking paint, and so I'm mimicking that with some craft acrylics, a little bit of black mixed with raw umber again, and putting those according to the pictures. Went back in and added a little bit more coloring with some burnt umber, again according to the prototype pictures. In between the air tanks was nice and dark, so I added some washed out black in there to mimic some of that grease. But light layers, always build up in small light layers. Wait until the previous layer is dry before you move on to the next layer. In here I'm giving the air tanks a little bit more depth by adding a very light wash around them, as well as some of the spillage from the fuel and grease. Flipping over to the other side, it's the exact same process. A very light layer here first. Let it dry. While it's drying, I'll attack other areas of the fuel tank, and once the side has dried, I'll then go back in with my second layer, varying the strength a little bit. You can see it's not totally uniform. That's by design. Going off of prototype pictures, I will vary the strength depending on what I'm looking for. Oftentimes I get distracted by something else I see, and I didn't like the side frames there, so I went back and touched them up. One of the final steps for the underframe is to weather the wheels. Now I like to do things as simply as possible, so rather than disassembling the side frames and getting to the wheels, I came up with this little hack, putting the locomotive on some running stands and just allowing it to run. I'm using my brush with some paint on it and just holding it to the wheel and letting it coat the wheel. Typically I'll do 2 layers of this, and in this case I'm using some Model Master kind of mud brown color. I do it to each wheel, then flip the model over and do the same to the other side. With the underframe mostly done, I turned my attention back up to the top of the locomotive. Originally I had done the nose incorrectly. I had thought it was a green color when in reality it was a faded black, almost a gray, so I changed that to the correct color. I then turned my attention back to some of the other horizontal areas on the locomotive, the front pilots as well as the step wells, and just adding a little bit more grime to those areas just to get things to look a little bit nicer. I went back to the walkways. They weren't quite heavy enough according to the pictures, and so I added another layer, doing the same technique that I did before, adding water first and then adding the color afterwards to allow the water to draw the pigment out so that you don't get any hard lines. Happy with the walkway and nose, I went to the roof next. So the very first thing I did here was the warning labels that were up on top of the roof. The prototypes have them pretty faded out to where they're basically white, so I went ahead and touched those up a little bit. The anti-slip walkway down the center of the roof was more of a gray color, and so I went ahead and filled that in and gave it a base layer of gray. I turned my attention next to the cab roof, and here I added in light layers, a little bit more grime, getting the roof wet first and then adding the pigment afterwards. And here was kind of a mix of raw umber and black, a little darker, so a little bit more black, and again kind of building up in layers. I get the brush damp with water first, put it on the roof, and then afterwards I put some pigment and water on the brush and kind of dab the brush into the water, and that carries that pigment out. Same thing that we did on the walkways. And I'm kind of varying where I'm putting the weathering in this case based on prototype pictures I'm looking at. It tends to gather in certain areas, and so I'm trying to mimic that the best that I can. One thing you'll notice a lot is the dynamic brake grills will tend to rust because of all the heat, and so I'm adding that effect here, as well as touching up a few of the warning labels that had gotten covered up. But a nice little addition to do there. Turning my attention back to the anti-skid walkway on the top, following the prototype pictures, added a little bit more corrosion onto that one center section, and just kind of detailing things a little bit. It's the small things that I find that tend to make the biggest difference. If you're looking closely at pictures, you can pick those things out, and the better you mimic them on the model, the better it will look in the end. It gives it a lot more character and a lot of kind of an individual type look. Now I had not done the panel lining on the roof prior, so I went ahead and did that now. Water mixable oils, mixing raw umber and black, mostly black, thinned a lot with water so that it flows into the lines. This next step was a bit more of a chore, but I think in the end it was worth the effort. Now my prototype had radiators that were kind of a white colored appearance because of all the heat that they had been through. So I went ahead and popped off the etched grills that ScaleTrains has on there just using a knife, and they popped off fairly easily. Just be careful not to break the tabs. Then I went through with some thinned light gray acrylic and built up the color in layers in order to simulate some of that kind of burned look to those radiator sections. With that done, I went ahead and reinstalled the etched grills. I then added some weathering to the grills themselves, a little bit of white, and my first use of powders on the model. In this case I'm using AIM powders, and this is grimy black. It has kind of a nice tone to it. I really enjoy doing it around the exhaust stacks. With the roof done, the pilots were one of the very few things left to do. Now the pilots are very similar to how I would do the underframe. Get some water on there first, and I'm adding some raw umber, always as a base layer. It's a great grime color, and then I will kind of vary the color from there. What I found after looking at lots of pictures is typically right along the lower edge of the plow and the pilot tends to be a little lighter, so I'll make kind of a lighter mud color with some raw umber and some gray, and allow that to get onto those areas and build that up a little bit. Again, many layers is what we want to do here. It allows it to flow a little bit better. You don't get the brush strokes, and things just look a lot nicer. Next, I turned my attention to the yellow areas, the anti-climber and the ditch lights and other areas similar to that. What I found on the BNSF units is that I like to use more of a raw sienna type color because the prototype yellow areas tend to get an orange or almost reddish type cast, and the raw sienna works with that very well. The MU cables get filthy on these units. First they get faded, so I faded them down to almost a white color and then covered up with some grime. And that allows it to look much more prototypical, particularly for this unit. To do the wheel splatter and mud kick-up, I get some pigment on a brush and thin it out, and then I use my finger to flick it onto the model. I will vary my colors a little bit, some lighter, some darker, some in the middle, and just kind of build it up lightly until I get what I want. With the bulk of the weathering done, I reattached all of the handrails. My first step was to paint all the attachments the correct color. On the BNSF units, where it attaches to the green, the handrail is painted green. Where it attaches to the cab, it is painted orange. Little details like that make a big difference. I then went through with some acrylics, went a little darker on them, kind of some brown and black mixed together, and started to apply that to the stanchions and get it into the grooves. Also painted the chains, which usually rust fairly dark on these units as well. On the front and rear handrails, those went a little bit darker. I also added some dust and grime to the white. And I just condensed hours and hours of work into about 18 minutes. At this point, I dull coated the model, and as a final step, I removed all of my window masking, and then I was done. I have to say, I was pretty pleased with the way that this model came out. It really was really fun to work on the ScaleTrains model. It's a great model to begin with. There wasn't a whole lot of detailing that needed to take place here. A little bit here and there, some electrical work. Adding the speaker in Rail Pro was a little bit more interesting, but it really made for a very nice running model and some excellent sound. The weathering itself was really a joy to do on this. It took some work. I loved the prototype that I chose. It was very interesting. A lot of different weathering patterns that I typically didn't see a lot of on BNSF units. In particular, I loved the large herald on the side and how it had kind of bled from bright, vibrant yellow to white in some places. I loved the extremely dirty underframe and very dirty side frames and such like that. It just gave the unit a lot of character, and so I was really happy to be able to model that one. I hope that you guys are able to learn something from this video. I'm sorry it was so long, but if you can at least pick up one or two tips from the things that I was able to do and hopefully add them to your own modeling, then I would consider it worth it in the end. Thanks so much for following along with the project. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as much as I did.